Hey and welcome, I'm Hammeh, and today we're taking a look at Overwatch's 18th digital comic, London Calling Part 2, in which we learn loads of things about Overwatch, Tracer and her life in London, including background behind the events of Widowmaker's Alive short. Now this is part 2 of a 5-part comic. For the first part, check the description in the video here, and then come back if you need to. I'll be going through all of the Overwatch lore talking points and interesting bits of the comic, along with a little light speculation on what new Overwatch story and lore we may have learned from it too. Suffice to say, this contains massive spoilers. Link for comic is in the description below. Go and check out playoverwatch.com. Do read it first if you haven't already, and then come back and let me know your thoughts. And as a quick one before we start, there's a giveaway. Check the pinned comment. Blizzard have given me 1 set of 25 and 3 sets of 5 Overwatch Halloween loot boxes on PC as codes to give away. Share a comment with your favourite part from the comic or your favourite new voice line or interaction from my previous interactions video, either on this video or the interactions video that I've recently released, and you'll be in with a chance. Terms and conditions will be in the pinned comment below. Good luck! Firstly, a real quick summary of the story, and if you've already read it, just check the timecodes in the description and skip ahead. We see Tracer at the beginning reflecting on her youth, that she was always late to everything and used speed to try and bridge the gap. Just because she now has the power that she has, it doesn't mean, in her opinion, she has the best timing. As we see her taking a trip to the Underworld to her new friend Iggy, Tracer meets Case, an Omnic leader in the Underworld, who sees her presence as an insult to their home and refuses to welcome her. Returning to Iggy's home and delivering the Iggy pop album she bought, Iggy explains to Tracer that Case's attitude is basically that some Omnics believe that by embracing human culture, they're losing part of what makes them themselves, what makes them Omnics. Iggy says to Tracer that their love of human music is something that they believe everyone can appreciate, not something that makes them any less who they are. Struggling to locate parts to help repair the Omnic Grid, Tracer and Emily reflect on how attitudes towards Omnics have changed in the 7 years since Overwatch fell, and the King's Row uprising. A package from Paceape, Hi Winston, interrupts Tracer, although we never actually find out in this episode what it is. Iggy in the Underworld, meanwhile, is trying to persuade Case and Omnics that Tracer can get the parts and wants to help. Case puts forward that Omnics fight for the whole, humans only fight for themselves. Failing to stop Case's Omnics going out to steal again, Iggy meets Tracer, who's found a regulator for the grid. But sadly, the Omnics now need more, a new transformer, as the grid powering the Underworld has fallen into even further disrepair. Iggy, however, has a message from none other than Tekhartha Mondatta, the leader of the Shambali Omnics. He wants to meet Tracer as he's in London. We get a bit about Mondatta's history through Tracer's eyes, as well as the Omnic spiritual awakening. Tracer hasn't actually seen him since the King's Row uprising 7 years ago, which she recalls as she meets him. Tracer also reflects again on the concept of herodom. At that time, she was wanting to prove to Overwatch that she was worth the effort they'd put into her. Now, she feels that being a hero is more of a weight than a feeling of flying. Asking Tracer to look forward when they meet, Mondatta asks her to be brave, as she was rescuing him all those years ago, and asks her to try and make the future, a one with no war between humans and Omnics, happen now, as the world does not have time. Meeting Iggy in the crowd, Tracer enjoys hearing Mondatta speak before having a bad feeling and promptly engaging Widowmaker on the rooftops in the events of the Alive animated short that we saw before Overwatch released. While the battle above rages, our view stays with Iggy, who feels something is wrong and gives chase. Running to the roof, we realise that Iggy actually saw Tracer recoil away as Widowmaker took her fatal shot, killing Mondatta in the process of Alive. As Tracer confronts Widowmaker and receives the blow to her chronal accelerator that left her in trouble at the end of Alive, Iggy sits shocked, wondering why Tracer didn't save Mondatta, and with a furious and maybe frustrated look, with her Omnics friends confused around her. Here's some of the interesting things I enjoyed from the comic, and analysis of all the details too. Firstly, I love the increased insight we get into Tracer's personality and history. We see punk Tracer as a kid in this great picture that I know that people already want to be a skin, but we get a reflective Tracer in the kind of looking back narration, narrating this perhaps just after the events of Alive. Now, Tracer we saw when Overwatch was first announced was a very cocky, cocksure, happy, confident character, and indeed we've seen this in the museum cinematic and in various other pieces ongoing in the Overwatch media outside of the game. But Tracer has grown deeper as a character over the 5 or so years we've known her since Overwatch's announcements and cinematics and comics, and since Overwatch was dissolved too in the 7 years of her life plus in timeline. recalling events of her chronal disassociation, the slipstream incident when she was testing a fighter for the RAF where she was lost in time. Tracer's saying that just because she has power, it doesn't mean that she kind of has the best timing, even though she's been lost in time itself. And we see various different examples of that in this comic. The first is bad timing in running into Case and his gang, albeit by accident when she visits the Underworld to see Iggy. Now, 7 years ago, when Tracer is on her way to meet Mondatta and recalling the time that she, Torbjorn, Reinhardt and Mercy rescued him and others in the events of the King's Row uprising, Tracer felt that was the time to prove herself, prove she was worth the effort, in her words, that Overwatch had put into her. Now, Tracer has grown since then, in 7 years. She doesn't feel like that anymore compared to her 18, 19 or 20-ish year old self then, depending on how much time you think that has passed since the events of Recall. Now, being a hero to Tracer doesn't always feel now like she thinks you think it will. It's not always leaping off a building. Sometimes it's more like a weight. She's not 100% sure, probably, about whether she should be helping and how she should be helping, but as she says to Mondatta later, she doesn't feel that she can just stand by. Emily was worried, as we see, about her being in harm's way, and she said as much, even if Emily knows deep down that doing something to help, it's what makes Tracer Tracer. And I love the moments, as always, between them again at home as they're looking for parts to try and help the Omnics. Tracer tries her best in the events of attempting to get Widowmaker away from Mondatta, but as we know, she recalls at that crucial point when the bullet flies from Widowmaker's rifle. After his death, Tracer reflects, if being a hero is being in the right place at the right time, what happens when you're not there? And she says directly, I failed, Mondatta is dead, it's all my fault. Now, in Tracer's voice lines over the last few years actually before this comic, we've seen her initially cocksure, confident self have a little bit more doubt about things, and indeed the events of her life in conversations between her and other members of the Overwatch cast. So there has been this gradual building of her character. Beneath the cheers love the cavalry's here facade is some self-doubt and some concern, and definitely thinking about the events of her life and whether she did what she could, perhaps even all she could. Now, how this caused her and how she will get along this journey of rejoining Winston and rejoining effectively Overwatch 2, or the new band of semi-outlawed Overwatch heroes, I can't wait to find out. And as I'll detail later in this video, there's some really interesting things about lore consistency and where these comics could take us as well with regards to that. Secondly, it's really, really interesting to see the different versions of Omnic Identity and Shambali Spirituality through meeting Mondatta and through Iggy and the Omnics in the Underworld. We kind of see these two sides of Omnic thought. The side represented by Case, that obsession with human culture is a dangerous thing, and he and the people around him are attempting to preserve or create their own, now in an environment of oppression and repression, as King's Row, London and probably the UK is that kind of place for Omnics right now. Case also believes that humans know nothing of honour or of the weight of words, seems to think that they don't stick by what they say, and that losing part of themselves by embracing human culture would be a thing. You then have kind of the middle ground, the sort of Iggy's point of view. Culturally believes that you don't have to turn away from who you are, being an Omnic, to appreciate things that everyone can appreciate, such as, for example, human music or music in general. You then have Mondatta saying at one point that people or things are all connected. Humans and Omnics together, says Mondatta, in a future united by compassion. He preaches equality and coexistence as he starts his speech to the crowd in King's Row that Tracer and Iggy are watching. He says to Tracer as he leaves, after speaking with her, saying that he doesn't have time, or there isn't time. We are not machines, we are not humans, we are messages and ideas. Now, this idea of consciousness, this being, this spirit, being above the material of which we are made, certainly a philosophical debate that Mondatta could have learned and studied elsewhere, as Shambali monks reflected on it, as Shambali Omnics, after the spiritual awakening, after the first Omnic crisis, and indeed Omnics in general, who had this awakening, reflected on too. Descartes, for example, saying this kind of mind-body dualism, that the body and soul are effectively separate things. You then have a school of thought which is more sort of scientific and biological in terms of events happening in the brain being part of consciousness. For example, humans and rabbits both have consciousness, but humans write poetry, and as far as we know, rabbits don't so far. So maybe consciousness is a matter of degree of scientific, of brain, of biological activity. Some researchers out there, even today, take things a step further here and say that consciousness is a property of matter, so fundamental that even an electron, even a particle, has a consciousness to a certain extent. That's panpsychism of all things. Now, this could work for Omnics if you took that approach. So Mondatta definitely has philosophical groundings in a lot of different schools of philosophy throughout the ages. I'm sure as an Omnic he could have probably studied it all pretty quickly. Who knows? Another thing I found really interesting was just the whole concept of Omnic-human relations as well as the spirituality. We see Emily and Tracer looking for parts, saying that every article is effectively state propaganda at this point, posing Omnics as the enemy. Parts that they're trying to look for the Underground are under government restriction, and Emily says, oh, every time that an Omnic snatches a bag, it's another crisis. We can clearly see that the mood that Reyes described in the Uprising comic of 7 years ago hasn't really changed, and in actual fact, it's got worse. The Omnics around Case are an example of this. We see the Omnics around Iggy also. Many of them not 100% sure. They're on the fence about things, and a very, very potentially dangerous situation. Those Omnics that Iggy is trying to persuade might not be with Case, but they're not against him either. They're looking for hope. One of them says, oh, you know Lena Roxton, you know Tracer? Groups like Iggy's friends are perhaps rare, we're not quite sure. And that's what makes the end of this comic so potentially dangerous and an interesting plot tee-up for what's going to happen in the next 3. If Iggy feels betrayed or confused by Tracer recalling to save her own life and letting the bullet go and kill Mondatta, will the Omnics that she tried to persuade that humans care? Are they going to go the same way as Case? We'll find out in the next few episodes, I think. Even an honorary such as Mondatta, 7 years on from Uprising, when Tracer goes to meet him, has been left cakes he can't even eat in the room. Tracer sees it as rude. Mondatta kind of passes it off. Is it an accident? Is it a studied insult? Is it something that people just forget? I mean, it's not the first time Mondatta's been to London. Mondatta also knows that individuals from both groups, Omnics and humans, need to come forward. He saw Tracer as maybe being one of these, being brave and courageous the last time he met her, and rightly says that war and conflict will serve neither side and destroy everyone if continued. I do love the utopian panel as Mondatta says this, of his vision of lots of Omnics and humans in close harmony. Do love the roses being presented by the Omnic to the person on the balcony up there. Lots of coupling up in that picture in general. Tracer says the war isn't over for everyone and that it's a dangerous journey, and says that Mondatta should be careful. Mondatta says we need action now and there's no time, and as he walks out and turns out of the room to go and deliver his speech, ironically, or perhaps prophetically, there is no time, certainly no time for him, or not much time for him, before Widowmaker strikes. I also really, really appreciated the wider background that we get and are going to get to the Alive short, as well as just the lore consistency that these comics are showing. So at the risk of nerding out, in the backdrop to Alive, we know that Tracer met Mondatta now. We know that Iggy knew this, and that the King's Row Omnics also knew this. This is Tracer's home. Iggy said to the Omnics that Tracer would help them. The Omnics were hopeful, or some of them were. Do you know how to reach her? Lena Roxton. Now Tracer, at the end of this comic, in Iggy's eyes, is responsible. She could have saved him, albeit by sacrificing herself perhaps, but didn't. This thing is now a lot bigger. There are witnesses to Tracer blinking away. We never knew what the consequences may be of Tracer's decision, of her failure to sort of stop Widowmaker before that shot, before Tracer may have had a choice between sacrificing her own life and saving Mondatta. Now we know. The Omnics at the end with Iggy are looking a bit disappointed and confused. Tracer's reflective dialogue as well. We've seen in-game, as I've said, Tracer's voice lines and interactions have been reflective for a fair few months and years before this, clearly setting this up.
Does it bother you, knowing that you could have saved Mondatta's life?
We are all responsible for the choices we've made.
Now, the other thing I really appreciate is the lore consistency of the art style of the writing in this comic, and you can see that there's clearly been an effort made, and from the last comic we know that Michael Chu was working on these before he left Blizzard as well, with the writers and with the artists, so it's really, really cool to see this coming together and that work too. Now, Tracer's disassociation slipstream moment, a lot of you may have not seen this trailer because it wasn't actually put, I think, on the official Overwatch YouTube channel. or certainly wasn't years back, but it's the Tracer Origin trailer that was kind of shown at the first BlizzCon way back many years ago when Overwatch was announced in the world. It's consistent there with the art style in the comic, which is great. We see the 7 years being cited as the time frame for Uprising when Tracer met Mondatta, consistent with the Uprising as well. The package from Winston, I also like this, as asides being hilarious, this isn't referenced yet in the comics. When is Recall compared to Alive? Winston's interaction with Tracer here, sending a package, is interesting. And what happens next after Tracer's chronal accelerator is damaged, as we know happens at the end of Alive. This could actually really tell us a lot about the timeline, these next few comics. Around Alive and going forward, it might help us date perhaps other things going on in the Overwatch world and when things that we've already seen, like the museum cinematic, actually happened. So there could be a lot of cool lore detail coming up with the next events as Tracer struggles apparently to sort out her chronal accelerator in the coming comics. Now, remember in Recall as well that Winston directly talks to Tracer at the very end, and the comic is also nicely following the Alive cinematic in the details, like all the buildings, the movements, the viewpoints. It's all really well referenced by the artist working on this. We see in the teaser for the next comic that Tracer needs help with her accelerator. How's she going to chat with Winston? Is she recalled already before all of this has happened? Will she be recalled after this? There's lots of interesting things that may or may not be solved or given more background detail in the next comics. So I'm loving the consistency and I'm loving the opportunity that exploring this time around Alive could offer us in the next 3 comics as well. A final point that I raised briefly by a flashed frame at the end in my last comic analysis video. Some people have asked, could Case be the Storm Rising Omnic? Well, maybe, but there are some questions around that. Remember that Storm Rising is cited as being kind of 6 years ago. Now, very rough timelines early on in Overwatch's history had the period between the end of Overwatch's 2 decades of peace in the world and the rough present day of the Overwatch timeline as being round about 7 years. So we have King's Row Uprising 7 years ago, according to the cinematic. Storm Rising happening 6 years or so ago. So my point to you would be that if the Omnic at the end of Storm Rising was Case, then what's he been doing all this time and who are they? To me, the fact that the time has passed, I don't know if the Omnic that we see at the end of the Storm Rising cinematic is actually Case. I feel that Case probably is their own character, and maybe this mysterious Omnic that we saw with Doomfist is perhaps a big bad that could show up in Overwatch 2. No proof they're not the same, but no proof they really are as well. So speculate away as much as you like on that one. And last but by no means least, what next? Well, the teaser for the next comic says, in the wake of Mondatta's assassination, the Omnics of London grapple with grief, anger, fear and despair as Tracer races to repair her chronal accelerator. Case gathers the Omnics of the Underworld. He says the time for Mondatta's message of peace is over. Now is the time for war. So we're going to see increased conflict, Tracer in the crossfire, a race against time to repair her chronal accelerator, and what happened post-Recall and where that dates things in the Overwatch world and timeline, as well as Iggy. How are they going to get involved with anything? We'll have to wait to find out. Thanks very much for tuning in to this analysis of Overwatch's second London Calling digital comic. If you like this video, throw a like, subscribe and comment with what you thought of the story, any things that you enjoyed. It really helps me out if you can do any of those things, so thank you so much. I've actually analysed all of the Overwatch comics for the last 5 years, shorts, lore and more, in-game and out-of-game, interactions, voice lines, books, short stories. Do check out the playlist here if you love the world of Overwatch. Thanks to my patrons over the years on Patreon, without whom many of my videos would never have been made. If you'd like to see how you can support the channel from $1, £1, or coin to your Witcher or Euro a month, check out patreon.com/Hammeh. It's on pause at the moment as I prepare some things for a new launch of new lore videos, so keep an eye out for that as well. Cheers for tuning in. I've been Hammeh. Take it easy.